May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord. Beginnings. Everything has a beginning. Beginnings are a lot of things. Think about your first day at school, your first job, your first child, your new house. The list of beginnings in our lives can go on and on. How many plans did you make when you were a child about how things were going to be when you got to be big? How many plans did you make when you were a teenager, a young adult, a new parent? I'll bet you started each new venture with momentous plans and a lot of ideas about how things should go. What do you want to bet Jesus did that too? He had 30 years to plan what his ministry was going to be like. He knew from the very first what his ministry and his life were to be about, just maybe not what it was exactly going to be like. The Gospel of Mark states very clearly, "And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Mark's Gospel takes us directly into Jesus' public ministry, his ministry of service. From the very beginning, Jesus leads with his examples of service. What he maybe didn't know was exactly how that would play out. The same probably held true for the apostles. They certainly didn't have a clue what they were getting into. Imagine one day you're fishing in the lake, and the next day you're following Jesus. They felt the call and dropped everything to be a part of it, but they didn't know what that would entail. They accepted a life of service that they never could have imagined. Many of them lost their own lives. The scope of the call the apostles accepted was totally beyond any experience they had ever had. No wonder they had to constantly be reminded of what was expected of them. Can you imagine what it must have been like for Peter, Andrew, James, and John to be in temple and watch Jesus expel a demon, and then walk across the street and cure Peter's mother-in-law shortly thereafter? Their exposure to Jesus and his ministry was profound. All they knew was they had to follow. And in that following, they plumbed the depths of their hearts and minds to become the servants Jesus needed to carry on after his death. The book of Mark shows us a life of actions directed to and for others, a life of service. The way Jesus chose to demonstrate that life was through both his preaching and his healing. The last sentence of today's gospel tells the whole story of Jesus' ministry. And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming his message in their synagogues and casting out demons. But in today's gospel, we're just beginning. We have just started to share the walk to the cross in Jerusalem. We have just begun the journey of enlightenment as to our mission as disciples of Christ. In short, we, along with the apostles, are beginning to learn what it is to be a servant of God. From the very start of his ministry, Jesus establishes a pattern of preaching and healing. In this way, he also demonstrates to the apostles the manner in which he expects his work to be carried on. Jesus repeatedly reinforces the service aspect of a life in Christ. In today's gospel, Jesus and his 4 apostles go to the house of Peter's mother-in-law after driving an evil spirit from the man in the temple. Nowhere in the text does it say that Peter knew his mother-in-law was ill, nor does it say they were invited. They just showed up. I have to say my liberal soul sighed over that. And I have to admit, I thought of Peter as an inconsiderate jerk for imposing himself and his 4 friends on a sick woman. The treatment of women as chattel, not just in the Gospels, but throughout history, is a rant I will save for another day. Suffice to say, my first reading of this Gospel annoyed me. My second reading caused me to rethink and to remember the hospitality rules that guided the people in those days. I came up with what I believe is a more plausible scenario. Of course the men would go to her home after temple. That's what they always did. They discovered her condition when they arrived and suggested to Jesus that they go elsewhere. But Jesus feels the same compassion that we do when a member of our family or one of our friends is sick. We make soup, we bring aspirin, we hold our loved one's hand. Why would it be so different for Jesus to do this? After all, he is a good man. He has friends. He has family. We know the end of the story, but the people of Jesus' time did not. They didn't know the journey he had undertaken. They didn't know he is the Son of God, the Redeemer, and the Messiah that they were told would come. At that time, they didn't know about the cross. This is just the beginning of his public ministry. Right now, he's just a guy who preaches, and by the way, expelled a demon. He might be a prophet, but they don't know that yet. So he takes the woman's hand, lifts her up, and in that moment, she is healed. The healing power of the Spirit reveals itself in Jesus' hand. Have you ever seen the expression of gratitude in someone's eyes when you do something nice for them? Have you ever seen their faces soften, their eyes relax and close? When you take their hand, do they squeeze back? Does their breathing get easier? Peter's mother-in-law maybe felt all those things, and then realizing what had happened, in her thanks, begins to serve the men. Not because she must, but because in this way she can demonstrate her gratitude. It's also a very visible way for her to participate in the ministry of serving. She may not have been able to run up and down the street proclaiming the good news, but she can, through her actions, become a servant of God. As you well know, there are many types of service. Rearing children is one of the greatest gifts we can give. Rearing children who are humble, who are kind, who see beyond themselves. Something as small as shoveling someone's walk when they can't do it. Moving your car so the disabled have a closer place. These are all acts of service that Jesus demands we do. But let's go back to the idea of beginnings. This whole preaching thing is kind of a new beginning for me. I've been doing short reflections for a while in the nursing home ministry and at Essie, where we talk a little bit about a Bible verse each day. But over time, I've discovered a deeper yearning to share my thoughts and feelings with others. And I want you to share with me too. In this way, I can serve. The books of the New Testament chronicle the life of Christ, the Acts of the Apostles, and the ongoing effect of Jesus' work on earth. The books of the New Testament are the basis for Christianity, the Christian life we live each day in our world 2,000 years later. Our call as today's Christians is to serve the world and our community as Jesus did. He tells us that to be true followers of Christ, we must put others first. We must be willing to take the hand of the ill. We must be willing to look into the eyes of the downtrodden and offer them a helping hand. We must be willing to proclaim through our actions that we are servants of God and are willing to stand in the face of adversity and proclaim our faith in the Lord and in our fellow human beings. We must be willing to confront evil and remove its power over us so that we can live the life that God has envisioned for us. Jesus spoke to the disenfranchised and the poor. He healed the sick and disabled. Jesus' words were good news because they spoke of freedom, justice, and hope for all. We as Christians are called to do the same. We are called to actively promote a future of hope for all. We are called to live in God's kingdom here on earth. That's the life we are to lead as servants of God. Amen.